Strange Visit. The wintry sky had that pale pearlescent blue that heralds the demise of the sun and the arrival of the shadows of night. I could see smoke slowly curling up from the cottage chimney. At least it should be cheery inside, I thought to myself. I knocked on the front door. The old boy I was going to meet took so long to answer that I grew quite cold as I stood there. I could swear that the temperature actually fell by a couple of degrees. Eventually, I heard the sound of a bolt being slowly drawn back. The door opened halfway. I heard it scraping over the stone floor. In the narrow gap, I saw the graven face of the old man, peering at me with his yellow, watery eyes. "Mr. Agus?" I asked. He nodded. "I'm from the Chronicle," I said. "I'm here to collect the story you wanted to tell us." The gap between door and jamb grew broader. The old man ushered me inside with a long, low sweep of his arm, and the door closed behind me on the free world outside. What a bare room I found myself in. There was no carpet. A small knitted rug lay just in front of the hearth. The only sources of light were the lambent flames from the small fire, and a low-power light bulb in an ancient standard lamp that stood in the corner to the right of the fireplace. A hard wooden chair and a tiny table stood to the right-hand side of the fire. A similar chair stood on the other side. Apart from a small bookcase, below the curtained window, that was the entirety of the room's furnishings. Mr. Agus seated himself on the wooden chair to the right. I noticed that on the table beside him there was a small and rather faded photograph of a young woman. I glanced slyly at the picture. The girl must have been quite beautiful in her day. "Sit down," mumbled the old fellow, gesturing towards the empty chair. His arm trembled slightly as he pointed. I sat down and took out my notebook and pencil. "So, what do you want to tell me, sir?" I asked. "Don't call me that," he snapped. I gazed at him in surprise for a few moments and then murmured, "Sorry." He nodded at me repeatedly, as if to say that sorrow was inevitable for us all. "I want to tell you a ghost story," he said. Then he stared at me unfathomably, before adding, "I'm hoping it will bring matters to a head." "Well, if it's a good story, I'm sure the editor will be interested," I replied. "After all, Essex is famous for its ghosts, isn't it?" "Yes," agreed Mr. Agus eagerly. "Borley Rectory, the most haunted house in England, right on the border of Essex and Suffolk. You know it? I was there." "When?" 1943. "Go on," I said. "I'll make notes as you speak, if I may." "It was February 1943. I was in the army, and so was my brother Bob. I'd been stationed at Scapa Flow, manning the 4.5-inch anti-aircraft guns that were installed there to protect the fleet. It was a boring job, I can tell you. Very few German bombers could reach us, but Bob was a hero. He'd fought in both the first and second battles of El Alamein in North Africa the year before, and he'd won the Victoria Cross. Typical. He always was reckless." "What did he do?" "He swung on the gun of a German tank under heavy machine gun fire and threw a hand grenade down a barrel, put the tank out of action, and then the silly bugger did it again on another tank. All the lads were clapping him. He loved the attention, you see." "Oh?" "Anyway, we were both home on leave that February. Bob was en route to a commando training school. I was just having a break from the boring grey sea. We turned up at this house. It was my mum and dad's cottage then, at more or less the same time. Now, Mum was overjoyed to see us. She just couldn't stop crying. But Mum wasn't the only woman who was glad to see us. There was this girl, Mavis, who I'd walked out with a few times before the war. As soon as she heard we were home, she was round like a shot. 'Oh, Tom,' she cried, giving me a right smacker on the lips. 'You look so handsome in your uniform, and you're a sergeant too.' 'Staff sergeant,' I pointed out. It was a rank higher. Then she turned to Bob. I could see her eyes eating him up greedily. He had that African tan and an air of invincibility about him. She couldn't stop staring at the purple ribbon on his breast. 'Bob,' she said, all wide-eyed, 'did the king pin that there himself?' "He did," said Bob.
"What did he say to you?"
"He said we could do with more young men like you."
"What did you say back?"
I said,
"Well, there's always my brother, sir." Mavis burst out laughing. I saw her glance at my empty breast. "So it's your turn now, Tom," she said. "You'll have to throw your caution to the winds."
"Just as soon as I get a chance," I replied, forcing a grin onto my whitening lips.
Anyhow, I asked Mavis out again. She and sister are inviting Bob along too.
We went to the pictures a couple of times, but Mavis seemed a little bit bored. When I suggested going again, she said, "I want to go on an adventure, Tom." "What kind of adventure?" I asked.
"Let's go to Borley and see the ghosts," she said, all excited like.
Bob laughed. "I'm up for that," he said. "All we need is 3 bikes." "All right," I said. "We'll go tomorrow morning."
"Yes, sir,"
said Bob, jumping to attention and saluting me. He was only a private, you see. Mavis giggled. Felt pretty pissed off by that. "I tell you," I said, "there's no such things as ghosts." We left about 10 o'clock on our borrowed bikes. Took us an hour and a half to get from here to Borley, because Mavis kept fretting about punctures and asking Bob to check her tyres. We pulled up on the gravel just outside Borley churchyard. "Oh, I don't like the look of those yew trees, all clipped like that," exclaimed Mavis, gazing at the topiary. "They look like poodles." "They certainly make the place look dark," I'd muttered, "especially under this sky." Huge dark clouds had been gathering as we cycled along. They looked like big grey battleships making black smoke. The graveyard did seem extraordinarily gloomy. "This is where the Reverend Bull, one of the ghosts, is buried," said Bob, showing off his bit of knowledge. "But the rectory's over there." We turned and looked across the lane to the giant ruins of the former rectory. The place had burned down in 1939, and by 1943 it was pretty ruinous. The roof had gone completely. The gable ends and some of the walls had collapsed. The place had looked pretty spooky when it was intact, but it was right scary as a weed-infested and shrub-ridden wreck, I can tell you. "Come on," said Bob, exhibiting his bravery again. "Let's go inside and poke around." He winked at Mavis, who giggled stupidly. As we started to wheel our bikes down the drive that led from the lane to the front lawn of the old rectory, a man came out of the rectory cottage, which had managed to escape the fire, being a separate building, and asked us what we were doing. "We're just looking at the ruins," said Bob. "My lady friend here's hoping to see something that might make her flesh creep." "Well, you take care," said the man. "It's a bloody dangerous place. The walls are liable to collapse without warning, especially in a storm." Just then this bloke caught sight of the VC ribbon on Bob's chest. "Here," he said. "You're not Bob Agus, are you?" "That I am, sir," said Bob with a broad grin. "Let me shake you by the hand," said the man, taking his pipe out of his mouth with his left hand as an extra mark of respect. "Who am I to tell you about danger?" "Always good to get a heads up, though, sir," said Bob. Oh, how I ground my teeth at that. Anyhow, the bloke from the cottage went back inside and we walked down to the lawn. We propped our bikes against a tree and then just looked around. "They say there's a ghostly nun as walks over this lawn," whispered Mavis. She studied all 4 quarters of the compass for any sign of this apparition. Of course there was none. Like I say, there's no such thing as a ghost. They're just fiction. "Yes," I said, "and the truth can be stranger than fiction." "Indeed it can," said Mr. Agus, probing me with his yellow eyes. "Anyhow, Bob started saying we should go inside the rectory, see whether we could find any poltergeists. The place was famous for bangs, knocks, raps, sighs, groans, and all manner of flying bits and pieces, and he didn't see any reason why the fire should have driven them away. So we went in. We pulled away a bit of boarding that had been put up in the big dining room window on the right-hand side as you look at the rectory from the lawn, and climbed inside. It was a bit rough underfoot, for the gable end had collapsed, dropping loads of bricks onto the floor. Most of the floorboards had gone anyway from the fire. Some of these psychical researchers who hang out there with their cameras and thermometers had put a few blanks down, so we managed to make our way through the hall, which had been the centre of the fire, to the kitchen passage safe enough. Floor was pretty good there and strong, so we walked past the pantry, cellar steps and sewing room and went into the kitchen, which still had a roof on it.
through the kitchen. The back stairs still went up to the first floor. We went up, looked in a few bedrooms and the bathroom, but the floor had completely gone towards the front of the house, so we went back down again. From the bottom of the stairs, a door went into the larder, and then another into the small dairy. I looked in both of these rooms, which were smoke damaged, but otherwise all right, and as I made my way back to the kitchen, I saw Mavis at the bottom of the stairs put her arms around Bob's neck and give him the kind of kiss I could only long for. What she did with her hands after that, I wouldn't like to repeat in polite company. I tell you, smoke came out of my ears. They didn't realise I'd seen them, for I edged back into the shadows so as they wouldn't notice I was there. Once they'd had enough, they went back into the kitchen, thinking I was already in there. I gave them a shock when I walked in behind them. Boy, it made me smile. "Oh, Tom," says Mavis, "we thought you were in here already." Oh, no," says I, "I've just been poking around a bit behind you." "Well," says Bob, "I reckon we ought to make our way back to the hall. That's where most of their manifestations start from, as I understand it." "You will hold me tight on them planks, won't you, Bob?" squealed Mavis. "Of course I will," he said. We made our way down the kitchen passage, and then along the planking as far as the library door, which was right in the centre of the house and open to the sky, and then the rain started to fall in great arrows. We turned and slipped our way along those bloody planks back into the kitchen passage. The floor was safer outside the sewing room, and we ran into the kitchen to escape from the rain, which was just bouncing and splashing everywhere. We slammed the door shut behind us, and all three of us leaned against the opposite wall, the one adjoining the larder, our clothes already cold and damp from just a few seconds under the downpour. There was a thunderclap and a rush of wind, and a cascade of heavy thuds on the ceiling above us. Mavis whimpered. Bob lit a cigarette and gave it to her. "Just a fall of bricks," I said. "It's the wind. Knocks them down." Bob nodded. And then we heard it. "What?" I asked eagerly. Mr. Agus fixed his weak eyes on me again. There was something very cold about them, I thought. I couldn't help but shiver. "Footsteps," he said, "coming down the kitchen corridor, and they were heavy ones. We could hear them so clearly over the roar and din of the rain. Yes, it sounded like a big man was walking slowly towards us, dragging one of his legs behind him." My flesh started to tingle in the back of my head, though, as you know, I don't believe in ghosts. Then the kitchen door started to open. It stopped halfway, and the three of us just stood there against the wall, shaking. We could hear laboured breathing on the other side, as if some being were gathering its energies to make its entrance into the room. The door was suddenly flung open, and a man stepped in. It was a man in uniform. I let out a scream. Such a scream, for that man was me. I raised a service revolver and fired. I clutched my chest. It was warm, wet, bloody. My knees buckled and I sank to the ground. I felt for my revolver. It wasn't in its holster. I looked up. The apparition had the light of triumph in its eyes. It dropped the revolver and vanished. I saw Bob run over and pick the gun up. I heard Mavis scream and scream. She would not stop. And then I died. Mavis became insane. She could not understand what she had seen, and her reason gave way. Bob was arrested and put on trial for murder. He might have been a war hero, but he was convicted, and he swung for it in Colchester jail. And I came back here. Mum and Dad both passed away about 10 years later. I went to their funerals. They're at peace, I think. But Bob isn't. I know that. And I've been waiting here ever since. My immediate reaction to this astonishing tale was naturally to make my excuses and head for the front door as quickly as possible. I was only halfway across the room, however, when I heard 3 loud knocks resonating from the very door I was longing to touch. I stopped dead and looked back. The thin white hairs on the old man's head were standing up straight. He began to tremble violently, and I knew there would be trouble.